get started, we have a few little issues to talk about today, like the entire direction of the United States and British labor movements. Welcome, everybody. I'm really very happy to be here with all of you to talk about this wonderful book and very ambitious, very analytical, very provocative book that Rudi Batzell has written. I love a book that raises huge questions about U.S. labor history, and especially when it's done through a comparative lens with the United Kingdom. Why did the U.S. develop as a relatively exclusivist movement, especially as compared to so many others, including the British? I don't know about all of you, but these are questions I've been thinking about my entire career. Um, was it the harsher anti-unionism of U.S. employers or the hostility of the state? Was it the embourbement of the American working class, as people from Werner Sombart to Philip Taft have argued? Was it the impact of immigration and the ethnic diversity that brought, or the legacies of settler colonialism? In this new book, Organizing Workers in the Shadow of Slavery, Rudi focuses on the legacies of slavery and racial capitalism to explain the answer to these questions. He compares in particular the fortunes of land reform in Ireland and in the US South, and argues that the legacies of those had a very long lasting impact in the US versus Britain. And I think it's really interesting that although comparative history has somewhat fallen out of favor, Rudi's resuscitating it here to build his ambitious argument. So I'm really thrilled that we're all here to discuss these issues today with a focus on Rudi's terrific book, and that we have four truly outstanding scholars joining us: Kevin Kenny, Laura Vapnek, Richard Price, and Naomi Williams. So I want to keep my part of this short. I'll introduce Rudi, and then he'll begin by introducing his book for us. Then I'll introduce our four commentators and turn the floor to them. Everyone will speak around 10 minutes. When they're done, we'll take a quick break for 5 minutes and then come back to open it up to all of you for questions, comments, discussion. And then at the end, we'll give Rudi a final few minutes to respond to everything that's been raised. So, Rudi Batzell is currently associate professor in the history department at Lake Forest College and lives in Chicago. His interests are the social history and politics of inequality, political economy, and extending across the intersections of racism, gender, and class formation. His first book, which we're discussing today, is Organizing Workers in the Shadow of Slavery: Global Inequality, Racial Boundaries, and the Rise of Unions in American and British Capitalism, 1870 to 1929. It was published last April by the University of Chicago Press. A second related book project is nearing completion by Rudi, titled Making Modern Inequality: Class, Patriarchy, and Racial Empire in American and British Capitalism, 1870 to 1930. I'm glad you worked in one extra year for that second book. He's also the author of two really excellent articles, one on the anti-slavery origins of Chinese exclusion, which was in Past and Present in 2014, and another article called The Labor of Social Reproduction, Household Work and Gendered Power, 1870 to 1930, in the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. So welcome to Rudi, welcome to all of you, and I'll turn it over to you, Rudi.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Julie, so much, and to the editors at Labor for hosting this, and Alex for coordinating and supporting our time together. Thank you to Laura and Kevin, Naomi, and Richard for responding and engaging with the book. It's such an honor to have your thoughts. Um, I'm really looking forward to that. And in these dark times, I just want to really briefly say, as a gathering of labor historians, if folks haven't heard about Tom Alter's situation, a tenured professor being fired, search Tom Alter, look up his GoFundMe, a tenured professor fired from Texas State University. None of our work is safe or possible when people are being fired for their political speech off of campus. So uh, I feel so excited, so honored to be here, but I also want to acknowledge some of the challenges that our profession and as scholars, labor scholars, we're facing right now. So this book is kind of unusual. Julie's intro might have noted this kind of my dissertation has sort of gone in a couple different directions, and initially this part of it was not actually central to the dissertation. This book emerged quite late, and it goes back to my undergraduate studies in many ways at Columbia University. And many of you will recognize maybe the imprint of Eric Foner and Barbara Fields. Perhaps the less obvious imprint, but one I just want to acknowledge is the historical sociology, the comparative historical sociologist Karen Barkey, who I was this like young kid from a town village of 3,000 people in the Midwest thrown into Manhattan, and Karen Barkey really like took me under her wing, was this profoundly important mentor, and my real commitment to comparative work and comparative study uh, goes back to that really informative undergraduate encounter with those folks. So I just wanted to acknowledge that trajectory for the formation of this book. So the book poses two big questions, right? First, right, why was the US labor movement so narrow? Why was it confined within these craft, nativist, and racial boundaries? And the dominant answer from most scholars has focused on in recent years that the US employers or the US state were uniquely hostile and oppressive to more inclusive forms of organizing. And I think there's important truth to that part of that story, but I think it needs to be questioned. And I think we need to look at the structural legacies of slavery in the US. In particular, the consequences of emancipation, the expectation of freed people, and the political promises made through the Freedmen's Bureau that there might be widespread land redistribution and a real remaking of the agrarian South. That promise and expectation was betrayed largely during Reconstruction, the important case of South Carolina as an exception, in part. But broadly, African Americans after the Civil War were landless and formed what I argue what can be thought of as sort of a reserve army of labor, this easily recruitable, highly vulnerable pool of laborers that could be recruited to break strikes. So it's the aftermath of slavery, the segmentation of US labor markets, and the power of mass racialized strike breaking to confine the US labor movement within sort of narrow racist boundaries. In pointing to racial boundaries as a key driver of this process, it raises, I think, even a broader and more important question. How do we think about class and race, the durability of racism and capitalism, more broadly, racial capitalism? And here, I think what I want to emphasize is the importance of economic geography. Scholarship, social history, labor history has often taken given political units, the county, the city, or the nation state sometimes, but that often flattens the unevenness of economic geography. And I think there's a lot of heated debate and contention around class and race. And I think we need to be more attentive if we're attentive to economic geography, we have a way of resolving some of those very thorny questions. Capitalism stitched the world together in newly intense but also profoundly unequal way. And the shadow of slavery in the book's title is meant to speak to that broader structure of economic geography and inequality. Never had the world been so connected, yet so unequal. So I want to the trajectory of the labor movement in these high wage cores cannot be understood apart from especially near peripheries, right? I think of Ireland in the British UK context and the US South as these crucial near peripheries that could supply low wage competition and strike breakers. And we have to understand urban labor markets, urban labor movements in the context of those crucial near peripheries. In speaking to this uh, racial capitalism literature, I want to make a sort of key chronological point, right? Up to the mid 19th century, I argue, racial boundary making had largely been driven from the top down by militarist entrepreneurs, by merchants, by settler colonial farmers. Uh, After the mid 19th century, with emancipation, with the spread of national rail networks and comparatively cheap ocean steam shipping, the global South and the global North became newly connected, and workers from the global South, formerly enslaved or colonized, came into potential and often actual competition with high wage workers in the global North. Workers in the global North responded defensively and hostilely to these potential migrations and connections. And so from the mid 19th century, racial boundary making becomes a very bottom up project driven by workers organized in new centralized unions and in mass political parties across the global North. So there's sort of there's an attempt to reorient and have a chronology of this history of racial capitalism. The book moves through three parts. The first part lays out the sort of comparison of land reform in Ireland and the South. Irish peasants, right, goes from a colonial territory primarily of tenants through this ongoing land war over 4 decades. A land of tenants is turned into a land of proprietors, right? Land reform, although gradual and partial, eventually succeeds in Ireland, and that reserve army of labor in Ireland that had been used quite effectively for strike breaking in the UK in the first half of the 19th century disappears as a mechanism. Part two looks at how unions and labor leaders responded. So part one is this very large, structural, macro level. Part two moves to the sort of meso-institutional level and how labor leaders pivoted towards more narrow racial boundaries in the key period of the 1890s. So there were attempts at inclusive unionism in both countries. And really, those rise and fall look very similar. What could survive the 1890s? And the AFL turned towards narrow craft boundaries, towards nativism directed at European migrants, and towards white supremacy, and a very clear reorientation of their sort of their conception of what was possible in the labor movement in this crucial decade of the 1890s. This speaks to the sort of classic Woodward thesis, right? What were the possibilities of the racial hierarchy after the Civil War? I agree with there was this period of openness, of possibility, of flexibility that then hardened and closed in a quite fundamental way in the 1890s. I want to emphasize the power, the driving factor of land reform and racialized strike breaking as sort of key background factors in that. Lastly, part three moves down to sort of the micro social history level. I look at workers' homes, both as a site of leisure and, of course, as a crucial asset. With the move of sort of Fordist mass production manufacturing, workers moved to new suburbs. And whereas in Liverpool in the UK, council estates integrated formerly divided and segregated parts of the working class, in the US, of course, housing and neighborhood segregation becomes a key spatial but also material uh, fracture within the 20th century working class, right? And you can see that the racial wealth gap is largest for working class people. And that is very much marked in home ownership. White working class homeowner coheres already as a real ideal in the early 20th century, and this pattern reproduces and continues the history of the United States having this fundamentally fractured working class. So thank you so much again. I'm so delighted to be with you, and thank you everyone for attending and to our commentators for offering your feedback.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Rudy. You managed to say a lot in 10 minutes. Well done. I really like the sort of economic geography aspect of this work. Okay, so now my job is to introduce the four commentators, and I'll do so in the order that they'll be speaking. We'll begin with Kevin Kenny, who's professor of history and Glucksman professor in Irish studies at New York University. His first book, Making Sense of the Molly Maguire's 1998, examined how traditions of Irish rural protest were transplanted into industrial America. He's written several other works since then. One that I'm in the middle of reading right now, very excited about, is The Problem of Immigration in a Slaveholding Republic, Policing Mobility in the 19th Century United States, Oxford Press, 2023. This book won the James Raleigh Award from the OAH. And it looks at very much how slavery shaped immigration policy as it moved from the local to the national level, from the American Revolution to the end of Reconstruction. Secondly, we'll hear from Naomi Williams, who is associate professor at Rutgers University, where they focus on labor and working class history, urban history and politics, gender and women, race, politics, and more broadly, really, Naomi is focused on the social and economic movements of working people. Naomi's chronological focus is on the late 20th century and advanced capitalism, and really her work strives to bring workers' voices to the front, I might add, in a really eloquent way. Their research also looks at how working people impact local and national political economies and how workers participate in collaborative social justice movements. Naomi engages working class history in urban settings, looking at low-wage service work, industrial employment, and workers in higher ed. They also see their work very much as a whole, teaching, service, and research as an engaged scholar activist. Their first book is A Blueprint for Worker Solidarity, Class Politics and Community in Wisconsin, published by the University of Illinois Press in our Working Class in American History series in January 2025. It looks at life histories of union leaders and labor community resources to examine how class identity and politics was transformed in the second half of the 20th century. Naomi also co-edited A Racial Reckoning in Industrial Relations, Storytelling as Revolution from Within, published by Cornell Press. Thirdly, we'll have Richard Price, who is professor emeritus at the University of Maryland, where he began teaching in 1992. And of course, Richard was my dear colleague and chairperson at the history department at UMD. Richard, in his early career, emerged rapidly as one of the key leaders on the social history of the British working class in the 19th and 20th centuries. His first book was An Imperial War and the British Working Class in 1972, a study of the place of empire in working class culture. His second book, Masters, Unions, and Men, Cambridge, 1980, focused on the workplace history of the British working class in the 19th century, focusing on the building industry. His third book was a more interpretive history, Labor in British Society, 1780 to 1980, on the role labor played in shaping British social and political history. And more recently, Richard turned back to the study of empire again. In 2008, he published Making Empire, Colonial Encounters and the Creation of Imperial Rule in 19th Century Africa, also published by Cambridge University Press. Finally, we'll have Laura Vapnek, who specializes in the history of gender, labor, and political activism in the 19th and 20th century United States. I can't wait to read her current book project titled Mothers, Milk, and Honey, A History of Infant Feeding in the United States. It's under contract with Oxford University Press, and it looks really at women's unpaid labor as mothers and explains how medical knowledge, consumer culture, and social policy together shape practices of breastfeeding and bottle feeding. This research was supported by a fellowship from the NEH back when we could do that. A related article appeared recently. It already appeared, is that right? Yeah, in the Journal of American History. Laura's previous publications include two books, Breadwinners, Working Women and Economic Independence from 1865 to 1920, published in 2009, and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Modern American Revolutionary, as well as numerous articles in Feminist Studies, the Journal of Women's History, etc. I have to say, these are four of my favorite writers commenting on Rudi's excellent book, so I'm very much looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say. Kevin, I'll turn it over to you first.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Alex, for organizing this and inviting me to make a few comments. Rudi, congratulations. Talk about a big book. You're taking on some of the oldest and most fundamental questions in US labor history in a comparative dimension. Through what you've described as a multi-scale or comparative analysis of US and British labour history over 50 years, you're covering an enormous range of material with extraordinary empirical and theoretical rigour. So, as a big book, Organising Workers in the Shadow of Slavery lumps and synthesizes, and that leaves a reader like me with little choice other than to split and to analyze. So I'm going to raise 3 points. One to do with the relationship between race and class. The second, the thesis on strike breaking. And then I want to offer a few concluding comments on your interpretation of Irish migration to Britain and beyond. The account of race is resolutely materialist, which I like very much. And in offering this account, you draw on the work of Barbara Fields. You also feel a need to distance yourself in some ways from that work. So let me comment on that conception of race and class first. You're sharing Fields' rejection of the category of race relations as a nonsensical formulation, and her rejection of the idea that race is an identity voluntarily chosen rather than a brand imposed. You also add, and here one has to go into the footnotes, that the notion that class is real and structural, whereas race is purely ideological, needs re-examination. I'm not actually sure that you need that last caveat to sustain your thesis. So clearly, on the looking at Fields's intervention in the whiteness debate in Ilwich in 2001, where she defines racism as the assignment of people to an inferior category and the determination of their social, economic, civic, and human standing on that basis. Well, that category is race, which she sees as a brand imposed, not an identity chosen. She also argues that race, when substituted for racism, the act of racism, race transforms the act of a subject, the racist, into the attribute of an object, the person on whom race is imposed. And then the various races supposedly enter into relations with one another. So here I think you're in perfect agreement with your undergraduate teacher, Barbara Fields. And she wrote earlier, and of course famously, that class and race are concepts of a different order. They do not occupy the same analytical space and thus cannot constitute explanatory alternatives to each other. I think the key point that she hastens to add when she calls race a purely ideological notion in that respect is she immediately adds that that does not mean that race is unreal. All ideologies are real in that they are the embodiment in thought of social relations, right? So I'm not sure that that distinction or caveat needs to be made to sustain your work. Where I would see a key difference is in the notion of Irish migrants as a racialized group. So if you take Fields's critique of the whiteness thesis as really not finding race per se as a useful category for describing any European immigrants in the United States, this is her critique of the whiteness debate. I wondered how your account of the racialization of the Irish in Britain would look in that context, because as I see it, Barbara Fields and Rudi Batzell are making a similar point about human exploitation, but for different reasons. In neither case is skin color or biology the cause of racism, even if elements of physical appearance work their way into the ideology. But Fields, as I read it, is making this point in order to explain how enslavers in the United States invented race to explain and justify their practice. And Rudi, by contrast, is seeking to explain British anti-Irish racism, not in the shadow of slavery, but in a context where slavery was historically absent. So I'm not sure that you and Barbara Fields are talking about race in the same sense, with the same meaning. I think the point I would want to raise for debate is whether, at least from the Fieldsian perspective, race is the appropriate or even a necessary category for explaining Irish history at home or abroad. And perhaps it is, perhaps race is the category, but it can't be in the sense that Fields intends, because for her, race in the US context is emerging as an explanation of slavery. So to really challenge the thesis, one could say that perhaps it's the absence of race and racism in the American sense, rather than the racialization of the Irish, that might be important in the divergence that you give us. In other words, U.S. labor history unfolded directly in the shadow of slavery in a way that British labor history perhaps did not. Okay, so that would be my most provocative analytical split. That's the first point I wanted to make about race and class. It's a tricky one to make in a short period. The second point I want to address is the relative importance of strike breaking, because this is the key to the book, and you remind us that employer hostility to organised labour was every bit as intense in Britain, perhaps more than in the United States. And so strike breaking becomes the key. The chronology of strike breaking is very important. Now, I think Rudi would be the first to admit, indeed, it's throughout the book, that the empirical basis of this claim can't be pushed beyond a certain point, right? We simply don't know the relative weight of black strikebreakers and European immigrant strikebreakers. And you constantly return to that point. You give us some compelling figures on the rise of black strikebreaking in the 1890s. You give us figures on the level of black migration from the South in the tens of thousands, but in a context where 9 or 10 million European immigrants are coming in. So there's a question there that might be investigated further empirically. You also give us reasons why black strikebreakers were used more often or were more vulnerable to exploitation, to do with the timing of strikes and the relative advantage of European immigrants in terms of employment opportunities or legal protection. On the Irish side, the key to the thesis is that earlier in the mid-19th century, as Marx himself observed, there was a readily available pool of exploitable labor used as strikebreakers, and that this declined fairly sharply after the 1870s. And there's a big divergence there. You have a readily available pool of strikebreakers in the United States. You have a diminishing pool in the British context. So that brings me to the third point I want to raise, which has to do with the nature of Irish migration. So Rudi attributes the decline in Irish strikebreaking in Britain to an overall decline in Irish migration to Britain after the 1870s. So the two are going hand in hand. The decline in migration, in turn, Rudi attributes to two main forces. One is land reform in Ireland, and that's the great absence in the American context as an equivalent tradition of land reform. And the second is declining wage differentials between Britain and Ireland. Wage differentials are very important in this book, both internally in the United States and then between countries. Right. So I want to comment just a little bit on that. Rudi makes a compelling case that a series of land reform acts, partly driven from below through the land war in Ireland, partly imposed, I think, from above in a quiet revolution, it's often referred to, really transforms the structure of landholding in Ireland as tenant farmers become independent landowners. Now, Rudi acknowledges the class divisions in Irish society that underlay these reforms. It's very important to understand that these reforms benefited tenant farmers. Tenant farmers became landowners, but what about the landless poor? Right. So there's a compelling question. There's a class division within Irish rural society that Rudi acknowledges. I might push it even further than you do, Rudi. Kirby Miller's classic book, it's 40 years old now, Emigrants and Exiles. It's been justly criticized on its main thesis, which is the roots of the conception of Irish emigration as exile lay in Irish culture. But there's a second part to that thesis, which is Kirby Miller argues very forcefully and I think persuasively that the chief beneficiaries of Irish emigration in the late 19th century were an emergent class of commercial farmers, the backbone of the nationalist movement. And they actually placed the blame for emigration on British colonial misrule rather than their own practices of eviction and closure and commercialized farming, right? So there's a class dimension to Irish society that we could push, I think, even further. And Miller's thesis for me is actually all the more persuasive because mass emigration continued in Ireland right through the 20th century, even after British rule. The second part of Rudi's explanation for the decline in migration has to do with the convergence in wage differentials. So that's, again, something I think we could debate because the thesis is that as wages converged between Ireland and Britain, migration declined, right? And you demonstrate that. But obviously, as a historian of migration, I'd want to suggest that any explanation of mass migration, whether macro or micro, that places too heavy an emphasis on wage differentials can collapse a complex process into actually maybe a simplicity that's derived, ironically enough, in this context from neoclassical economics, right? So we need to look at more than wage differentials. We need to look at risk, remittances, family and social networks, institutions, cumulative causation. And I'm getting a message to end. So I just want to end on this point for you, Rudi. So Irish migration did decline. From Ireland to Britain. But at the same time, it continued on a massive scale to America. So 2 out of every 5 Irish-born people were living abroad in 1890, and the population of the country was 8.5 million in the middle of the 19th century, was down to 4 million at the end. So here's a question for you. If wage differentials can help us explain migration, right? So take your point that wage differentials had converged to parity between Ireland and Britain. Well, then, if wage differentials are still the main cause of migration, I would expect a similar emigration rate from Britain as from Ireland, right? Vis-a-vis America. So there's something in my mind that we have to explain. Why is emigration so high from Ireland in that context? And I'm going to suggest that the answer to that question might take us back to the Great Famine. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much, Rudi.
Can I just jump in, Julie?
Wow. Thank you so much. I'm not allowed to respond yet, but thank you.
Yeah, sharpen your pen.
Yeah, so again, Rudi, thank you for this. And thanks for the invitation to participate in the conversation, and especially to Alex for getting us all organized and doing all the logistics. And also, I want to put in another plug for using the GoFundMe for Tom Alter and his family. There's no health insurance, they're kids, and there's just a lot of things that are going to be coming up. There's a lot of support around the legal fight, but there's still lots of other things. This book comes out right at at a time where well, I am, and those around me are really considering how do we step back from the brink of fascism, right? And how do we save democracy and democracy on a practical everyday level for the masses of people in the United States and around the world. And I think that this book can help us answer, or at least find some ways to approach answering the question of what do we do in this moment? Not only how did we get here, but how do we get out of here, and how do we create the future that we want to see? I think Organizing Workers in the Shadow of Slavery really illustrates the power of racial capitalism and disrupts, right, these ideas of American exceptionalism for those who are still holding on to it, right? And the comparison of British and US capitalism through race and class boundary making of organized white workers highlights the failures to sustain any real multiracial labor movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I think it's really important for US historians and also for global labor historians, right, to think in particular ways about racialization and racial capitalism. And to Kevin's point, I also went to the footnotes and I was like, you didn't need that last clause about Barbara Fields there, right? Like, because I do think so much of what you're doing is what Fields was urging scholars to do, right? To really think in different terms about our conversations and our understandings around race, right? And this materialist approach that you're using around racial boundary making, the when, the where, the why that you talk about on page 10 in the introduction, right? But it's, situating your argument really on what you call the pivotal moment of the 1890s, right? And not just you, right? Just looking at the 1890s. And, my first point is really to think through how can we wrap that into actually even, I mean, it's a big book, right? But even a bigger story. Because while I would argue that the 1890s is a pivotal moment, it doesn't really, you can't really answer the questions of wage differentials, right? And land reform without, sorry, without understanding what got to that moment. And you do a good job of kind of laying out, especially in the comparison, right? Laying out the trajectory of this potential of radical reconstruction. Um, but do we give radical reconstruction too much power at this moment, right? In the first decade after the end of the Civil War, right? I think there's a lot happening in attempts to build larger, more I'll use the word democratic racial, I'm sorry, more democratic labor unions, or labor movements, I should say. Um, and they're crushed violently, right? And I think that what causes the crushing is important in terms of white workers and their racial boundary making, because it becomes very clear to them that if they're going to hold on to the little bit of power they have to protect themselves, right? And this need to protect themselves is really what you say is it causes them to narrow their focus. Um, but I think it happens before the 1890s, actually. I think it's already happening. And you use Baltimore, right? The case of Baltimore is really instructive. You can look at Seth Rockman's work on in Scraping By in the mid 19th century, and you really see the ways that capitalists and the politicians that they had, you know, that were allowing them to shape the labor marketplace, right, in Baltimore in the 1810s, 1820s, 1830s, right, really created intense competition amongst both free workers, black and white, and enslaved black workers, and how they use that dynamic to really push down wages. And then what it does for working people in the city of Baltimore, right? And I think that those experiences play out later in terms of, you know, one part of the labor movement in the late 19th century, right? Um, Racial terror and lack of land reform in the Jim Crow South, right? It really puts black workers in without any source of political power to push a black working class agenda, right? And at the same time, it doesn't happen without cross-class white efforts to prevent black mobility. And so if it isn't seen as cross-class within white communities across the North and South, across the United States, right? regardless of the region, then we're kind of missing this continued racial boundary making. And the failure of land reform in the Jim Crow South and in that Reconstruction period, right, is racialized, right? And so I think that matters to white workers who are looking to build power in the same time, and with this influx, right, of new workers. And it was in the interest of male skilled white craft workers, right, to have exclusionary unions in the short term. It continued to bite them in the foot, right? If I'm using that correctly, right? But they continue to do it. And so then we still don't know why, right? We still don't have a good answer to why. And I don't think that racialized strike breaking is the best answer in that regard, right? And it's mainly because of the black working class labor movements at the time and their more democratic approach to unionization and their willingness to join unions. And so if we look at the fall of the Knights of Labor, um, in terms of the political repression, the mass deportations, right? It tells a different story than just looking at it of competition between AFL unions and the Knights and strike breaking around the railroad strikes, right? So if you have to include in the conversation the mass deportations and anti-immigrant sentiment, the attacks on all labor as anarchists, right? The attacks on free speech that were happening around that time. And I think that in that broader context, right, in those interrelated efforts, then that really puts pressure to say, okay, so why why aren't more white craft unions willing to join forces so that they're protecting each other? I'll stop. I'm running out of time. That goes really quickly. But I want to get to a point that I keep harping on in a lot of these conversations, and like the answers are in the book. And also, as historians, I think part of the thing that we can do a better job of is being really clear with our definitions and the language that we use and the way that we're posing even the questions that we're asking and how we're asking them and how we're responding to the answers, right? So solidarity, right? So this is a question about why isn't there more solidarity across for working people in this time period, right? And I think it's important if we go back to Eric Olin Wright's definition of solidarity, and it really is on those who are benefiting the most to give up some of their gains, right? And you had this conversation, we talked about this on another talk about your book, right? White workers really did have to give something up, right? They had to let go of some of their power in order to build this. And so how can we frame the narrative in such a way that it becomes clear, right? Even racialized strike breaking. It really is capitalists and politicians and the arms of the state, right, that create the platform for strike breaking. And so putting it in that language and taking it out of the workers, right? And it's not like workers didn't have control over it, but they weren't the power brokers as it was playing out. And so even just shifting the language a little bit around that, then it helps us answer different questions, and it kind of takes the pressure off of unions and union leaders and rank and file workers, right? Because now they see this is in a context of racial capitalism. And if we're going to dismantle racial capitalism, then that can create a multiracial international labor's movement. I'll stop. Thank you, Rudi.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Richard, we'll turn things to you now.
Well, thank you very much for asking me to comment on this book, which I enjoyed reading very, very much. I want to make 5 points. First thing I want to say is that this book seems to me to be a model of how to write comparative labor history within a materialist framework, seeking to link the character of various labor movements, in particular their tendencies to inclusion or exclusion of other working class groups, to seeking to link that character to how they were positioned in relation to the reserve army of labor. I suspect Marx would have nodded his head in agreement with this formulation, as indeed would Eric Hobsbawm, many of the ideas in Batzell's book reminded me of Hobsbawm's essays in Labouring Men. Whether Edward Thompson, the other great giant in labour history and British history, would have agreed with this, I don't know. I suspect less. Anyway, Batzell focuses on the consequences for the US labour movement of the presence of an African-American reserve army, an army which failed to escape the legacy of slavery and served as a continual brake upon any attempt to overcome the color line in terms of organizing. In the UK, the equivalent potential reserve army was the Irish, but he suggests that this pool of available labor was dried up by the success of land reform in Ireland in the late 19th century, a reform that was patently absent in the American context and which denied British employers of any readily available strike-breaking force. So the British labour movement in its formative years was structurally free to be inclusive in organizational goals. But although Batzell's book privileges the structure of the labour market, he doesn't ignore, to use a perhaps somewhat antiquated phrase now, superstructural forces. Indeed, he emphasizes how culture, state structures, politics, and consciousness were imbricated in and not dependent upon the material conditions of worker existence. Batzell ties class and race together as truly mutually constituted. There is another reason for the book this is another reason for the book to demand our attention. I don't know about American labor history, but as far as British history is concerned, I think it's an example that could be usefully adopted. So there's nothing vulgar about Batzell's Marxist conceptual framework. And I should also remark that the book rests upon an impressive body of research across a wide range of archival sources, which is another reason to pay close attention to it. Furthermore, as has already been suggested, this book is profoundly relevant to our present moment. It reminds us of the abiding significance of the slave heritage and indeed of Jim Crow. Along with books like Steve Hahn's Illiberal America, it provides scholarly evidence that the existential challenge in American society remains to how to face up to and escape from that heritage. So let me turn from the methodology, as it were, to the key arguments about the formative importance of the Reserve Army of Labor. And my second point refers to the Reserve Army, this Reserve Army notion and Ireland. I think Batzell makes a convincing argument about the importance of the Reserve Army of Black Americans that the Black Americans played in shaping the American labor movement. I also think that Batzell's side glances in this respect at Argentina, South Africa, and Australia are both insightful and on point. But what of the comparison with the United Kingdom? His argument that the possibilities of the Irish developing into a reserve army similar to the ex-slaves of the American South were stymied by the success of land reform in Ireland is an appealing one, especially if we fuse it with the largely rural immigration that left the UK for the United States and other settler colonies from the 1850s onwards. And it may very well be right, but it is largely inferential, seems to me. Is there actual data to back it up? The Irish were always regarded as an underclass and tended to be racialized, at least in certain situations. But obviously this was never elevated into a system the way it was in the United States. And what about another important part of his argument? That state structures in the UK were less likely to support strike breaking than in the US. So this is my third point. I would caution against overdrawing the differences between the US and UK state structures in relation to labor organizing. The distinctions lie perhaps more in the way they fit different patterns. Take the 1890s, for example, a key decade for his argument. As Batzell knows well, the 1890s in the UK saw an employer offensive which used the law to cripple union actions by removing the protections they thought they had secured through legislation in the 1870s. This culminated in the well-known Taft Vale case, which made unions liable for financial losses due to strikes. Now, it is true that this was reversed by state action after the 1906 election, which saw the first emergence of a Labour Party in Parliament. But from the Combination Acts onward, the state was quite capable of stepping in to disadvantage Labour organisation. They did so to defeat the general strike in 1926, and Thatcher successfully destroyed the coal miners' union and crippled and thereby severely weakened the labor movement in 1984-85 using distinctly American methods of strike breaking. So the state structures argument, I think, can be examined. Let me turn now to the 1890s to make passing commentary really on the importance of that decade to labor history of both countries, because this is one of the things that struck me about the book, that this was the moment when, Batzell argues, the moment when the American labor movement turned from the possibilities of a more inclusive organizing mentality to an exclusive one. And it was the moment when in the United Kingdom, similar kinds of formations were formalized also, but in a different way. The definite shift towards racialization of union boundaries in the United States and towards a more inclusive tendency in the UK was significant about this decade. It was the moment too, as Batzell recognizes, when wider social and cultural trends emerged that reinforced these different trajectories. What we might call the massification and the nationalization of popular culture, the bureaucratization and formalization of structures of working class organization, the recognition of the value of union organization for industrial stability and peace. So the 1890s are really very significant. I agree entirely with Batzell about that. And finally, I want to suggest that perhaps the differences between the UK and the United States were situational as well as perhaps more than structural. In the UK, a racialized lower class was largely absent from the processes that Batzell describes. Although, of course, there were non-white people in Britain and had been since the 17th century, they were few in numbers and were confined to specific locations, such as Cardiff and other places. But it's important to recognize that where they were a local presence, as in the maritime sector of the unions, as Batzell recognizes, and once they became a national presence from the 1950s onwards, similar tensions arise in the British working class organizations that Batzell details for the United States. The working men's clubs, for example, were an important part of Labour's cultural network from the 1880s onwards, and they fit very well Batzell's thesis about inclusion in the sense that they were class-based rather than sectionally based. But once the British working class begins to lose its dominant whiteness after the Second World War, boundaries of exclusion rapidly appeared in this quintessentially working class institution, as they did in the labor movement more generally. So these questions, I don't think, undermine Batzell's work, but rather they're testimony to the intelligence and thought-provoking nature of his contribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. And finally, Laura Vapnek.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. It was great to just get a chance to spend some time with this book, which, like Julie said, I think has, maybe brought a lot of us back to questions we've been thinking about for a long time. Before we got started, the panelists were talking about how challenging it was to just, pull out a few threads to talk about for 10 minutes because there's so much here. And now as the fourth commentator, I think that's been multiplied by 4. But I'm just going to sort of forge ahead. But just to say, I think the fact that the book can sustain, so many different perspectives just sort of speaks to how rich it is and how much how much food for thought it provides. So as everyone has mentioned, organizing workers in the shadow of slavery engages with some of the most fundamental questions in US labor and working class history, namely, why has the US labor movement been relatively weak and narrow in comparison to the labor movement in other industrializing nations? And so the problem, Rudi argues, was not just racism, but following the insights of W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, the failure to redistribute land to formerly enslaved people, making them a kind of reserve army available for use by employers to break strikes. So rather than making common cause with Black workers and other workers of color, white leaders of the American labor movement tended to view Black workers as a threat and to exclude them. This clear, well-argued, and original book contains many important insights, and it opens out, like I said, in so many different directions that it's exciting to talk about it, but also challenging to do it in a short period of time. So I have a few points I'd like to emphasize. First, I want to linger a little bit on the insight about Black workers being used as strike breakers, because I think that's something, I feel like that's a fact that's sort of been hiding in plain sight. It's been scattered. It's something that we've observed. You can kind of observe it in a number of different situations, but I think it's interesting the way that Rudi drew it together here to make a larger point. Secondly, I really appreciated the time that this book spends in the 1890s and in the pivot from the AFO, the pivot from the Knights of Labor to the American Federation of Labor and what that meant for future organizing. So lines of race, skill, and gender all hardened in that shift. And I want to hark back just briefly to Lenora Berry, the general investigator for women's work, to think a little bit more about what was lost in that shift. Third, I'm interested in bringing women into the conversation and thinking a little bit more about how the shadow of slavery extended into the race and gender segregation of the labor market. So first, the point on strike breaking. I think I was sort of thinking back on that in relation to sort of women's labor history and going back to the 1909-1910 strike of shirtwaist makers in New York, which was the first kind of mass strike that brought women into the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And that strike was notable for the participation of young Jewish and Italian immigrant women, but it also reflected the racial segregation of the labor market at that point. The daughters of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were taking jobs in factories, but Black women were still excluded from those jobs. So in 1910, which was around the time the strike happened, 90% of Black women in New York City were working in domestic service, where they contended with long, irregular hours, sexual harassment, and problems getting paid. So a lot of similar problems to the women who were striking but maybe even more so. Mary White Ovington, a white reformer who became a founder of the NAACP, hoped that the general feeling of solidarity developed during the shirtwaist makers strike might extend to Black women. She gave a sort of positive gloss on it in her investigation of the economic circumstances of African Americans in New York at that time. But an editorial in the New York Age, a prominent Black-owned newspaper, defended its decision to run classified advertisements placed by companies whose employees were on strike, as well as its refusal to urge Black women not to act as strike breakers. Prior to the strike, the union had not shown any interest in bringing Black women into their ranks. And so very much in keeping with Batzell's thesis, the editors asked, could we therefore, in sense and justice, advise competent Negro girls while idle and until now denied employment to turn down this opportunity? Why should Negro working girls pull white working girls' chestnuts out of the fire? And so I think, you know, there's just like, there's a lot of resonance there with what Batzell has presented in this book. So how did we get here? And here I'm going backwards, which I always tell my students they need to organize their presentations chronologically, but I'm going to flash back a bit here to the Knights of Labor. And as Rudi reminds us, the Knights of Labor, which was the national union that sort of rocketed to prominence during the Great Railway Strike of 1877, took a much more inclusive approach to labor organizing, with the notable exception of its hostility to Chinese workers. Lenora Berry, who was the general investigator for women's work for the Knights of Labor, championed equal pay for men and women, the 8-hour day, and an end to child labor. Berry also highlighted some of the ways that the ideology of the male breadwinner failed to capture the realities of working class women's lives. She traced her own trajectory as a labor organizer to her inability to support her 2 young children after she was widowed. And I think this brings us to sort of a larger point, which is that a woman's wage barely covered self-support, much less support of dependence. So much of Rudi's argument here centers on the uneven geography of American capitalism and capitalism more generally, and the ways that employers exploited differences between the core and the periphery. But there's not much discussion here of women and gender. And I know a second volume discussing women and gender is in the works, so perhaps this is coming soon. But during the entire sort of 50-year period that's under discussion here, women were routinely paid less than men, and they did not win the right to vote at a national level until 1920. And even then, Black women, like Black men, were denied the right to exercise their full rights of citizenship in the American South until the 1960s. So I guess this kind of brings me to a question, you know, if women were routinely paid less than men, were they too a reserve army that was, you know, within the core and the periphery as well? So this kind of made me think about how the shadow of slavery perhaps fell differently on men and on women. I was also thinking of children, but didn't really have time to get into that. But the question sent me back to another, it made me think of an even earlier study by Du Bois, The Philadelphia Negro, and the sort of insights that he offers there. And he remarks, particularly, he focuses a lot in that book on Black people's relegation to unskilled employment, on people getting stuck in jobs in domestic service just because it was very difficult to get any other type of employment. So he says, no matter how well trained a Negro may be, how fitted for work of any kind, he cannot, in the ordinary course of competition, hope to be much more than a menial servant. And I guess here, this sort of reminds me a little bit of a point that maybe has come up in previous comments, which is like, is that insight really captured by the pattern of racialized strike breaking between, the 1870s or the 1920s, or is it expressing something, a sort of longer trend of the segregation of the labor force and the notion that skilled, dignified, well remunerated labor is the exclusive province of white men. So there seems to me there's like a longer sort of deeper thing that's happening there. Du Bois talks about Black men being excluded from trade unions in that book. And he also focuses a lot on Black women's very limited prospects for employment. And he includes a special report on domestic service by sociologist Elizabeth Eaton. And Eaton found 90% of Black women in the 7th Ward of Philadelphia to be working in domestic service and 60% of Black men. And she noted that Black men and women took these jobs because they lacked other options. But regardless, these jobs were still not secure. So in the 1890s, Du Bois and Eaton both comment on the fact that Black household employees are facing a lot of competition from white immigrant workers. Eaton also remarks on the fact that domestic employment was unusual because Black women and white women were earning more or less the same wages, but the general rule of men earning twice as much as women still held even there. So a few conclusions. First of all, I think it's worth considering gender along with race, class, and place as a significant axis of social difference and economic inequality. Second, I think it's important not to relegate women exclusively to the sphere of social reproduction. Most working class households were mixed economies, and not all women aspired to stay home and perform the unpaid labor of social reproduction. And many did not have a choice over whether or not that was what they were going to do. Third, if we focus exclusively on the AFL from the 1890s forward, I think we risk repeating some of its biases, including its exclusion of women and of workers outside of craft unions, including those who worked in household employment, who, of course, as we know from other scholarship, had their own trajectories of organizing. And last but not least, I think it's important to consider challenges to the AFL model of organizing in the early 20th century, particularly as they were waged by the industrial workers of the world, which organized across lines of race, gender, and skill. And I think that union, that effort at sort of more inclusive organization was defeated not so much by racialized strike breaking, but by the political repression that was so evident during and after World War I, and by the Red Scare, which of course is something that we could also look to an earlier Red Scare in the 1890s. So thank you. That's a lot. I know that's a lot crammed into a short presentation. So I'm glad we'll have time for more discussion.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you, everybody. This is really, really great. These are amidst all the excitement about Rudi's book, as somebody said, maybe Kevin, that a book this ambitious certainly asks us to ambitiously rise to the occasion and figure out what we think. So thank you very much. We're going to take a 7-minute break. We will come back at 3:25, and I think you all know that this will become a published book forum in the journal. And so everyone who's here as audience, this is when we really need to hear your ideas and thoughts. And it really helps Rudi and the commentators to kind of see what's on your mind and what issues occur to you. So put your thinking caps on, and we'll be back shortly. I'm sure 7 minutes was more than enough, Rudi, for you to figure out answers to all of the critiques. Easy, right?
Yeah, I have like 5 pages of notes here. I don't even quite know where to begin, but thank you all so much. And now the audience will get to chime in too. So
Yeah, yeah. No, these were all really, really great commentaries. All right, welcome back, everybody. It is 3:25, so we have about 35 minutes, and we have big, big issues on the table. We need to solve the problem of the history of the US labor movement. No biggie. Um, so you're welcome to put comments in the chat, but I think it's nice to turn the floor over to those who have questions or comments. So if you raise your hand, I'll recognize you. Can I see everybody, Alex? Anyway, I can get things rolling. Um, Rudi, you mentioned being influenced by historical sociology, which of course is such a different discipline from history. Historians, like me, at least, like to think in terms of lots of different factors all smushing together and making things happen, as Richard put it, maybe situational as much as structural. But you've focused in on this one explanation, which is a very historical sociology sort of thing to do. Now that you're done with the book, do you think go back and think differently about that that choice you made?
I think one book isn't meant to be the entire story. I see it as an intervention in a conversation where other parts of the story have been very well told, and that kind of, this is not the final all-encompassing synthesis. No one can no one can attempt that. But I do value the attempt to tell like real clear causal stories if possible, like that from that kind of like and be very upfront about what you think are driving particular changes and processes. So that's just a very deep way of I think how I think about and approach history. But I wouldn't like I think sometimes historical sociology would say like here is the true account. Here is like here is the one thing. And I would hope that I would be clear. I think this is an important, crucial part of the story. This, the arguments about um several of the comments mentioned longer, right? Longer histories of racial segregation and labor markets. It wasn't just a pivot of the 1890s or uh, just employer and state hostility, right? The oppression, the deportation of radicals, the political environment. Um, yeah, I think I'm not trying to suggest that a sort of single causal story is correct, but that this should be part of the conversation and perhaps challenge the centrality of what I see as those two elements really dominating the story. Not to say that this account should replace those others, but that it should at least be put in dialogue with
Mhm.
the other accounts that we've received.
Mhm. Nicely put. Okay, we have a question or comment from Eileen Boris.
Yeah. Well, it's wonderful to see this, and I'm really looking forward to volume 2. And in some sense, my question comes out of that, because how can you separate the centrality of social reproduction and the role of women in the household in sustaining, but also some sustaining family economies and sustaining divisions of labor? I kept on thinking of two scholars, and because I haven't read the whole book yet, if you deal with them, maybe you can just tell everyone. One is Gutman's focus on community. So where does community play in this? And the other is Cedric Robinson's notions of the Black radical tradition and racial capitalism, which are both ideological and materialist. So that's
Mhm.
the comment I wanted to make for now.
Mhm.
So should I reply, Julie, kind of back and forth here?
You could, or you can say, let's take a couple more questions.
I'll let you decide that. So yeah, I mean, Eileen, thank you, and I think this gets to Lara's point. I do agree they are inseparable and interconnected, but I was trying to do it all together. That's the book I thought I was writing, and it just got too gigantic and too complicated. And I realized no publisher is going to publish a first book that's like, 1,000 pages or whatever. So it just like I had to decide to draw some boundaries. And of course, those are artificial and problematic when we draw those boundaries in our and so I absolutely agree. I was hoping to tell that story of those connections all together. And I hope the what I thought I was doing, what I was attempting to do before I said, okay, I'm going to just take out the labor and racism comparative dimension and really crystallize that before moving on to this more integrated account of uh, gender, race, and class domination, really told in a hopefully cohesive way. So I completely agree. On community, I mean, I do spend the later chapters in that more kind of Gottman social history mode. I talk about like Fordist masculinity, like sports makes a surprising appearance here. I think one of the things that labor organizers and socialist editors were very frustrated by, that like workers did not want to read, long socialist tracts. They wanted betting odds for their local, professional sports teams. And the rise, I think it speaks to Richard's comments about sort of the massification and the nationalization of working class culture in the 1890s, right? The rise of organized sports, both at a sort of an amateur participant level and as a sort of professional spectacle, really coincides with the rise of organized labor. And I think there are important affinities and connections to tell there. Um, so I do talk about households and home ownership as not just an asset, which we think about its material dimensions, but as a site of leisure and sociability, in which new kinds of gender understandings of working class identity for both men and women, I think, were fostered in the early 20th century. A new Fordist masculinity and femininity were sort of the invention of the modern family, right? In many ways, or the invention of the traditional family, rather. The traditional family is a very modern invention. It has this sort of material social history with the rise of sort of Fordist industrial suburbs and the unequal access to those things. I think the discussion about Black women, especially, but also men being confined to domestic service. These are really important dimensions to think about. So sports and housing and the kinds of networks of sociability and leisure. One thing I'll just say I didn't talk about. I think one thing the book tries to recover is the radicalism of a demand for more, right? I was just at a sort of labor history discussion and sort of only demands for control, only challenges to sort of managerial prerogative or sort of the whole system of capitalism can be taken as sort of real radical demands. But I think simply asking for more money for less work, the kind of fundamental bread and butter unionism should not be dismissed so easily, right? Just asking, demanding more money for less work is an important redistributive claim that should not be sort of dismissed because it sat at the foundation of these broader aspirations of community, of family life, and of course the gendered formations that were happening within and racialized formations that were happening within those spaces. Certainly, Cedric Robinson is a big, important kind of the Black radical tradition sits at the sort of theoretical underpinnings. I definitely think Julian Go has a great, the sociologist has a great article on some of the tensions on in Robinson's understanding of racial capitalism, and I definitely think that we should see racism and capitalism emerging together, not so much that racism preceded capitalism, but forms of domination and inequality that preceded capitalism that have parallels or sort of uh, uh, anticipate racial domination, then become systematized within this new sort of world economy, so connected yet so unequal that arises with capitalism. So I'm definitely have tried to situate myself within that tradition and hopefully contribute to it in some way.
Thank you. What are other people thinking? I see you. Yeah, great, Nick.
Hey, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
So yeah, this was absolutely fascinating. Congrats to Rudy. I thank you all of you for this. So I can't manage to lower my hand. There we go. And so I'm very much out of my depth in this period and this history, but I'm teaching the survey right now. And so I'm trying to get my head around some of these big themes and how this intervention might shape how we teach this trajectory. And so this is a question that kind of goes back to something that Kevin raised about sort of how we understand race and class as categories and sort of who constructs them. And so, going back, Rudy, to something you said in the intro about the idea of sort of the creation of racial boundaries being a top-down project before the Civil War, but becoming a bottom-up project. And so then thinking about these questions people have raised along the way about kind of community and the construction of a working class, Gutman, or for that matter, E.P. Thompson, right? The idea that class is a constructed lived relationship among people who understand themselves to have self-interest. Is there a process happening here by which sort of working class people are reconstructing their class identities along racial lines in response to this? Like, is that sort of the process you're identifying? Or is this more about the kind of conflict at the point of production around strike breaking? And I don't think those are entirely separate, but I'm thinking about this question that sort of came up about the locus of class and community and sort of where and how sort of like political identities are developed in here. And so I'm like, it's a little malformed, I realize, as I framed it, but I'm sort of interested in like how you're relating to these different ideas of like class as joining and defining who we are, but also sort of defining exclusions in that process. And if that's the right way to think about class in your model, or if that's insufficiently materialist for what you're doing. So yeah, I apologize for a bit of a half-formed question, but that's what this got my wheels turned on.
No, yeah, thank you. And so I definitely would push back on, I think what I heard is your phrasing as like people had like a class identity and then that became racialized. What I want to suggest is that class formation and racial boundary making are always entangled. There's never a non-racialized version of class formation. And that's like that was very upsetting for me to like come to that position in a sense because like uh, I support class politics. I think they need redistributive class politics are essential, and it is discomforting, it's uncomfortable to recognize the I think necessarily racial entanglement of that. It's just that in some instances, I think rather unusual instances, the explicit racial boundaries around class formation are less visible or less articulated because of relatively contingent particularities of where certain workers are in global patterns of capital and labor's movement across capitalism's combined and uneven geography. So that's like a super abstract answer. But so, yeah, I wouldn't say that there is like class formation that then gets racialized. I think these things are always co-constitutive. And that is like a really discomforting thing, I think, to wrestle with. But I think that is important. And so to me, that's right. Stuart Hall, right? Race is the modality in which class is lived, right? That like for in it clearly in settings where class formation is explicitly racialized, people understand themselves as workers as also as white workers. Their racial identity, their class identity are fundamentally fused together. To go to I just to briefly speak to maybe to Kevin's question, which I think is kind of adjacent. I think Barbara Fields and I probably actually, you're right, agree on our understanding of racism pretty much one to one. I think some of her um, interpreters and simplifiers have maybe drawn the dichotomy, but I think probably where I differ from her is on the class as simply materialist. I see the class side as sort of less simply structural than I think she does. So I think our disagreement, or my slight disagreement, I so much thanks and honor to Barbara Fields as a mentor and teacher. But my disagreement with her would, as I think you correctly point out, would not so much be on the racism side of that dichotomy, but how I see class formation as a similar kind of formation process. So racial boundary making and class formation are two historical processes that are of a similar order and are fundamentally entangled.
Mhm. Mhm. I think, yeah, Naomi. Mhm.
Give me a little bit of space to say something that I skipped in my comments. And Rudy, I'll send you my draft to over the weekend so that you can see that. But I think that's part of what I was wanting to get at in the conversation at the end about definitions and the language that we use, right? Because a lot of what you're saying is implied, right, in the writing, but you don't say it explicitly, right? You don't lay it out. You don't lay your argument out. You kind of you use the footnotes to put like the meat of some of the stuff that you're talking about in there. And I think that's really important to look at how class is being shaped, right? And how race is being shaped and how you can't separate those two in what's playing out in this time period. And the other thing that I would, what I, the other, one of the other things that I wanted to point to was where's the Black labor movement in the North? Right? It's there. It exists, but it's not a part of the conversation. It's not in the discussion. And we talk about the US labor movement as if it's a monolith and as it's one thing, right? And there were different labor movements. And you talk about them and right, you talk about it in different moments, but it's because it's not named explicitly.
Mhm. Yeah, Kevin.
Uh, could I come in on a slightly different point? And Naomi, I know you said you might need to be leaving the meeting as well, but we can stay on this point, or it's a slightly different point if it's okay. Um, so one of the things about comparative history that always strikes me is like you compare A and B, but often you're really interested in A. And so you look at B to see what B can tell you about A, right? So we've got the United States, we've got the United Kingdom, and we're very focused in this conversation so far on what this can tell us about race and class in the United States. But your book, of course, is doing both co-equally. You've got four cities, and it's comparative history in a very rigorous sense. And I just, if I could, wanted to return to the third point that I made in a fairly truncated way at the end, which is we do have declining migration to Britain from Ireland, and we can link that to the decline in strike breaking. The point I wanted to make is that at the same time we have massive sustained migration from Ireland transatlantic, but not from Britain at the same rate, even though wage differentials have converged. So I just wanted to point to something that we mightn't touch on in this conversation, but I will in my written piece, which is the more on the Irish and British side of it, because you're suggesting to us in the introduction and conclusion that we could think of the post-emancipation South in late 19th century British vis-a-vis the Irish as parts of the global South. You use that provocative phrase. And then you also say, you return to that at the end, and you say that, more or less quoting here, that although the picture offered here is gloomy, Ireland offers a ray of hope. Again, not to be a curmudgeon, but just my job is to split and to analyze right in face of the big book. Ireland was a great place if you could manage to stay there. The people who stayed there did rather well. But as I mentioned, 2 out of every 5 Irish-born people were living abroad by 1890. And the population of that country was 8.5 million in 1845. It was down to 4 million by 1900. And it's still only 7 million today. So the demographic catastrophe of the mid-19th century, the country still hasn't recovered. And again, in my job as splitter rather than lumper, I just want to throw that cautionary note into to counter the I don't want to be a curmudgeon, but to counter the ray of hope and the optimism take, and to bring Ireland and Britain in as co-equals in this conversation. Because, like you, I'm working on both sides of the Atlantic.
And if I could jump in here in a minute, we're going to turn things over to you, Rudi, for solving all our problems and summing up. But I wanted to add to this. I've been influenced by the arguments and research of an ex-graduate student of mine. I think I mentioned him when we did a roundtable on this book at the OAH, Kyle Pruitt, who what he's arguing is that in the face of US labor not able to achieve its rights by the end of the 19th and early 20th century, in the face of government hostility, employer violence, and anti-unionism, etc., that the white labor movement decided that its only hope was to stress its rights, their rights as white male citizens and valuable producers, their rights to a controlled labor market. And that they, in this, were influenced, of course, not only by racism and the legacies of slavery, but also by the model they had created of Chinese exclusion. The Chinese exclusion taught them the power of controlling the labor market and excluding from jobs certain people. And Pruitt has been able to trace kind of step by step how by the first years of the 20th century, they were very deliberately applying the lessons of Chinese exclusion in order to get rid of Europeans as well, particularly the new immigrants. So he kind of turns it into almost like a republicanist or sort of possessive nationalism of the white working class, which is not to minimize the slavery, because I mean the impact of racism and sexism, because I think those things obviously are central to white workers' understandings of themselves. But it's rather just to say that those identities became funneled into this effort to control the labor market. And then, of course, they won support from various elites, and that kind of snowballed and led to the 1924 Immigration Act and a much more sweeping Asian exclusion, and as well continued segregation and violence towards African Americans. Anyone else from the audience want to offer their solution to these problems or ask Rudi a question before we let Rudi sum things up for us? Okay. All right. We'll hand the floor to you, Rudi.
Thank you all so much for your comments and engagement. It was a lot to digest here. I look forward to the opportunity to like more fully and thoughtfully engage with this in the written form. That will be really rewarding. I do think, yes, the one thing we have very much focused on the US side of the story, but I do hope to make a kind of co-equal contribution. And I think, right, some of the invisibility of Irish people in sort of British labor history is pretty amazing. And I think when you put British labor history and the mirror of US history, you realize how stunning that oversight is. I think, Kevin, your point about another story like the famine obviously had a fundamental impact on migration and Ireland's demography and class relations and everything. And I think your points are all very well taken. And I would just I agree, and I don't think wage differentials are the sole part of the story. And I know migration historians have spent a generation or more kind of trying to move away from very simplistic models like that. And so this is one of the risks of doing, I am not really a migration historian, but then I sort of, in this sort of comparative work, you end up stumbling into various historiographies and I try to do my best to be responsible and attentive to the debates where I can be. But I think downplaying Irish class tensions, I take your point on that. That's a well-made point. Um, Naomi, I think your point about Baltimore and the law. Oh, no, Naomi's not here. But sorry, their points about the longer history, especially in places like Baltimore. And in northern places where emancipation came earlier, I mean, I think this is a post-emancipation story, and like the real drivers of this at sort of a nationwide scale and sort of global scale occur post mid 19th century. But the antebellum North, we already see these patterns of racialized exclusion, occupational segregation. They are less systematic, they are less pervasive, but of course they are there. And I think I would take that to say the chronologies are uneven and complicated. And of course, there are earlier patterns of this in places like Baltimore with a large free black population as well as a large enslaved population that was sort of in participating in the labor market, as Seth Rockman has shown. But I still think, despite all of that longer history, it's worthwhile being clear about moments of change and pivot. And I do think the 1890s we can still see as this crucial period of change. So I fully agree with all of that longer backstory. It is somewhat more complicated. I try to gesture to that, but of course it can't be fully appreciated. Naomi talking about black unions. Of course, this is one of the things that I people need to write more histories of the sort of all black unions that were organized in the face of racist exclusion. And Cedric de Leon has a history of sort of this in the mid 20th century that just came out. But so at the local level, most of these were fairly short-lived, very local. But there is a really broad history of Black labor organizing and militancy in the face of racial exclusion. So, of course, absolutely, I agree. We should not let the AFL uh, speak for the labor movement as a whole. That would be very misguided. Yet, um, craft unions, despite their race and gender exclusions, were not weak. One, I think, Laura, you said, was the U.S. labor movement weak? I think they were exclusionary and unrepresentative of the broader working class, but the US building trades were probably the most powerful, politically powerful, and well-off workers anywhere in the world in the early 20th century, right? I mean, so some of them were quite powerful, and it was often the unions that had the most strict uh, racial craft boundaries. The all-white railroad brotherhoods were incredibly powerful. They won their own labor board. They won the 8-hour day, right? The railroad craft brotherhoods were incredibly powerful. So weakness does not necessarily or narrow bound. They were unrepresentative of the broader working class and deeply problematic, but not necessarily politically weak. And this gets to the point of like nativism and exclusion. The AFL saw its sort of fundamental political victory of the earliest 20th century was achieving nativist restriction, right? They really celebrated and understood that was their sort of their claim to fame. They even have this bizarre moment in the 1919 steel strike in Pittsburgh. They're speaking to all like recent immigrant workers, like, hey, join the labor union that like fought for and then during World War I secured immigration restrictions. Like, uncertain how that political appeal is going to go for you. But they really, on the terms that white organized labor set for itself, the AFL set for itself, uh, they secured that political victory against quite militant and organized resistance from employers on the question of immigration restriction. So I just say, right, even though craft unions are narrow and unrepresentative of the broader working class, they are not necessarily weak institutions, which I think speaks to Naomi's point. Like, why didn't white workers abandon this? Well, it was working for them. I don't see why white workers would abandon this. They were winning the things that they wanted. They were getting their working class suburbs. They were buying homes. They were buying houses and cars and participating in this new mass consumer culture. So it is a very unsettling thing to realize, right? That this form of narrow racialized craft unionism is effective for those who it empowers, even as it breaks and fragments the broader working class capacity to sort of mobilize more inclusively. Richard, thank you so much for your points. The 1890s, I talked about the sort of massification of culture. On state posture, I just want to respond to that point. I thought that was important. What I try to suggest, I very much agree with you. In the 1890s, this crucial moment, I agree the US state, right? The British state is deploying troops to protect strikebreakers. There's like the big confrontation in Hull in 1894, I think, right? There's massive military attempts to support employers and break strikes. But rather, the divergence in state posture is not a cause of the survival of inclusive unions. But once British inclusive mass unions actually survive the 1890s and begin to grow in the early 20th century, and you have the initial success of the Labour Party, the step back from the British state, I agree, 1926, other examples, right? It's not fully like the UK becomes a workers' paradise, but it does seem clear that after 1910, the British state is no longer willing to use troops to protect strikebreakers and encourage strikebreaking in the way in which the US state very much remains willing and committed to doing that. So the state divergence, I think, is perhaps less dramatic than I may have oversold it, but I think it is a result of these different patterns of labor organizing in the early 20th century. The land reform, inferential migration, you're absolutely right. It's one of the, the local close archival history is in these four cities. One of my future research projects is to go to those rural districts and really try to unpack the connections between land reform, migration, and how those things unfold. Because you're absolutely right. It is kind of an abstract, inferential level of analysis. I think it's plausible, but the actual, real mechanisms, the real history, the kind of on the ground account for that side of the story is absent. And I think you're absolutely right. I 100% recognize it, and it's something I'd like to turn to in future work. Laura, I think into Eileen's question, I was right. That I wish I could have had the sort of full gender household labor, women's labor market participation. Honestly, that is in some ways an equal or even more important story of this period. I mean, like huge, fundamentally important changes are happening in household organization, the kinds of paid work that women have access to in this period. And of course, they are connected. And I was trying to build that integrated story, but the analysis just got too massive and too complicated that I decided to sort of draw the boundaries. This book is big enough as it is. I couldn't try. These things are always connected, and you wish you could do everything at once, but I absolutely I absolutely agree with you, and I'm working on that side of the story, and I hope it will be yeah, out in the world fairly soon, because the two were really written in conjunction, and they just grew to such proportions that it was too, just in substance and analytical dimensions, too complicated to do it all at once. But there's part of me that wishes that 2,000-page book or something could have been written. But who would publish that, right? That's ridiculous. Who would read that? Nonsense. I think we're at time, so I just want to say again, thank you all so much. Your questions, your criticisms were spot on. It's given me a lot to think about. Some things already on my mind, some new things to consider. So thank you all so much. This has just been an incredible honor to be part of this.
Yeah, thanks from me to everybody too. This was a really, really rigorous and smart session. Thank you, Rudi, for taking some heat. That's what it's all about. But I also think we all are grateful to you for writing this fantastic book that brings us back to some of these classic questions. So thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for coming and sticking with us. We appreciate it. And stay tuned. This will appear in Labor in roughly a year.
And don't forget the forum that Latcha's doing on Wednesday on Emma Amador's book on the politics of care, focused on Puerto Rico. That is a postponed session from the Latcha conference in Chicago. So we have sent out, and it's on Blue Sky, and it's been on the Google list, and please come.
Yeah, yeah. And do what we can for Tom Alter. Thank you, Rudi, for raising that. All right, everybody, until next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.